Okay, on behalf of the Center for Middle East Studies here at the Josef Korbel School of International Studies here at the University of Denver, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's lecture by Rami Khouri. I want to begin by thanking Jim and Amy Peck for their generosity, for their support for today's event, and particularly for their support for initiating this forthcoming program, this student exchange between the University of Denver and the American University of Beirut. Last night over dinner, I overheard Rami saying that the existence of the American University of Beirut is one of the best examples of the deployment of American soft power in the Middle East, with incredible positive results, both for the people of the region and the United States of America. And we here at the Josef Korbel School at the Center for Middle East Studies are happy to play a role in strengthening those bonds and those relationships between our two institutions and between our two countries. I was trying to remember the first time, as I was coming here today, I first heard of Rami Khouri, and I think it was when I stumbled across one of his columns that was reprinted in the Toronto Globe and Mail, where I was living at the time, and I was immediately captured by the insightful analysis that Rami Khouri was advancing on a whole series of complex and pertinent issues related to the problems and challenges of political development in the Middle East. I sort of view Rami as a bridge, as someone who has been able to interpret the complicated and sometimes confusing politics of the Middle East for an American audience. His writings on the Arab Spring, I think, were some of his best writings. Every time I was asked to give a talk about the Arab Spring, I would simply read something that Rami Khouri had written, quote him, and sometimes try to pass it off as my own thoughts, but of course they were not. They were Rami's insightful analysis, and sort of his body of work, his writings, his media analysis really has led to this invitation today. In terms of his more formal resume, Rami Khouri is among the preeminent public intellectuals in the Arab world today. He's the director of the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut, and he writes an internationally syndicated column and is editor-at-large of the Beirut-based daily, the Daily Star newspaper. He's a member of the Brookings Institution Task Force on U.S. Relations with the Islamic World, a senior fellow of the Middle East Initiative at the Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, and a fellow of the Palestinian Academic Society for the Study of International Affairs in Jerusalem. In 2006, he was co-recipient of the Pax Christi International Peace Award for his efforts in bringing peace and reconciliation to the Middle East. The title of his talk today is Has the Arab Spring Failed? Reflections on the Struggle for Democracy in the Middle East. Rami will speak for approximately 30 minutes. I will have some questions for him by virtue of a commentary, and then we will turn it over to you, the audience, for questions and answers. So without any further delay, please join me in welcoming Rami Khouri to the Josef Korbel School.
Thank you, Nader. Thank you all for coming out. There's a chair here that's $5. Anybody in the back wants it? Special price for students. Another one here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I've never been to the University of Denver or Korbel School, so it's a double pleasure to be here and an honor. And I'd like to take the opportunity of being here to share with you some thoughts on what I think is actually going on in the Middle East, the nature of the developments and the changes, and to maybe look a little bit back, but also look a little bit forward in terms of what does this all mean, and what should we anticipate should be going on, or what might be happening in the region. It's almost 3 years. In December 17, it'll be 3 years since Hamad Bouazizi set himself on fire in Sidi Bouzid in rural Tunisia and started this series of rolling uprisings all around the Arab world, and sparked this incredible movement of dynamism and self-expression and activism and revolutions and uprisings and all different grades, of many different kinds of activities that continue to shape the Arab world. And it's constantly changing, and it has a wide variety of different manifestations and different conditions in different countries. So there is no single Arab Spring, there is no single Arab revolutionary movement. There is a wide variety of examples of citizen dynamism, citizen activism, expressing grievances and complaints, and aspiring to a better world that they want to create with their own hands, and responding to their rights and their sense of their rights not only as citizens but as human beings, to be treated fairly and decently by their own societies. But the changes going on are so complex and so varied and changing so fast that it's really very difficult to come up with any kind of overview of where are we and what should we expect. The best that we can do, I think, is take a pause and say, all right, what's happened in the last almost 3 years? What can we identify as actually new, significant, and perhaps lasting? And what is just fleeting and temporary? What remains to be done? What are the achievements and what are the things that haven't been achieved? And what should we anticipate may happen in the future? The real dilemma in trying to do any kind of analysis about the Arab uprisings, as I prefer to call them, is that all the events that are happening are at the same time sequential, simultaneous, and cyclical. And what I mean by that is that they're sequential in that something happens and then a month later something else happens and a month later something else happens, and there's a whole process of major historical developments that keep occurring in every country, and sometimes they're positive and sometimes they're negative. So the sequence of events that goes on is never ending. They're simultaneous in the sense that the Arab countries are trying to do something that no other country in the world, I think, has ever tried to do. And it's not just, we're not one country, we're 22 countries. And every single Arab country, to one degree or another, is experiencing some form of citizen activism, some kind of expression of citizen demands, and some kind of uprising. In some cases, it's just people tweeting and sending stuff out on their cell phone messages. But they're simultaneously trying to achieve what in Western countries, in your country here in the United States, was achieved over a period of about 200 years. In other words, if you take a country like Egypt, what we're experiencing at the same time is the equivalent of the Revolutionary War. First of all, the uprising, the citizen revolt for independence, then the war for independence, the Revolutionary War, then the first constitution that was created, and then that fell apart, and then in 1789 you came back and you tried it again and you had a better constitution, which then you needed to keep amending over many years. And then you had 80 years later a civil war, and then another 60 years after that you gave women the vote, and then another 20 years after that, in 1965, you gave black people the vote. So it took you 200 years almost to actually implement a democratic process, a system of democracy that actually gave all its citizens equal democratic rights. When the great American Revolution created the United States of America as a bellwether of freedom and democracy around the world, it was a democracy in which white men who owned land and slaves had rights, but virtually nobody else had any rights. And you didn't tackle the issue of slavery and women's rights and minority rights and immigrant rights and all the other things that you tackled. You didn't tackle them in 1776 or 1789. You decided to leave them for later because they were too hard. And the difference is, in the Arab world, people don't want to leave anything for later. They want to solve all of these big issues right now. So this is why it's so complex to simultaneously define your constitution, shape the nature of your government system. Do you have a presidential system, a parliamentary system? Address the issue of minority rights, address the issue of religious pluralism, address the issue of the civilian-military balance, address the issue of the role of women in society, address the issue of relations between the central government and the regional provinces, all of these things at the same time. I mean, nobody in the world has ever tried to do such an audacious thing except the Arab citizens today. And this is why it's so difficult that you cannot possibly do this in one fell swoop. It's just beyond the capacity of human beings to achieve a satisfactory outcome to resolving all those big sticker items about your national identity, your national values, your national political system. But this is actually what is going on, and this simultaneity of the addressing these big issues is one of the reasons why things are so complicated. So you might achieve some agreement on the role of Islam in the Constitution, but then you have an issue of, well, what about women? Do women have full rights, or how are women treated in the Constitution? Then what about the freedom of the press, and what about foreign aid? And so these multiple issues make it very difficult to achieve a clear, neat, linear breakthrough. And I say they're cyclical because, as you see in Egypt, you make a step or two forward, and then you take a step backward. And so when the revolution happened, you had the army, the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces, SCAF, overseeing a political transition. And they were in power for over a year, until June 2012, from early 2011 to June 2012. The army ran the country with full citizen approval, but also with huge pressure from the citizens to get the army out of politics and just do the transition, thank you, go back to barracks and let the elected civilian authorities run the country. And then the elected authorities did, and they turned out to be totally incompetent, the Muslim Brotherhood and Morsi. I'll talk about that later. And then the army came back, and this time actually with a more deliberate coup-like move that built on popular resentment and popular pressure in last June, and threw out Morsi, took over power, put the Muslim Brothers in jail, and we're now in this phase of the second transition. So that's when I say cyclical, you make some progress and then you go back, and then you make some progress and you go back. So these three things together, the cyclical, sequential, and simultaneous nature of these huge, huge issues of nation building, state building, political definition, national values, societal relationships, are all going to be addressed over the coming years, but do not expect a clean, neat outcome within the next few months or even the next few years. And if we look at this situation, we ask first, well, what has changed? What has actually changed, and maybe lasting change? I would point out a few things that are important. The first is that we have seen and continue to witness in the Arab world the birth of citizens and a citizenry. You have a citizenry in a country, all the citizens together are able to act like citizens. They not only feel that they have rights and they express those sentiments, but they also feel that they have the capacity to bring about the implementation of those rights by creating the political system that they think needs to be created. So the birth of citizens and this birth of citizenries, I think, is a new, epic, historic achievement that cannot be rolled back. The second thing is that these citizens are acting in a new public political sphere. We've never had, in the modern Arab world, a really credible public political sphere, meaning a public space in which people can debate political issues through the media, through political parties, street demonstrations, non-governmental organizations, open meetings like this in different ways. We've never had a really open public political sphere in which different ideas could be discussed and debated, and leading the way towards democratic transfer of power from one group to another through elections or other processes. But that public political sphere has now been born. It's young, it's fragile, but it exists. And again, in Egypt, you see the best example of people repeatedly in the last 3 years, repeatedly going back to the street to manifest their discontent with existing political behavior of the groups in power, and expressing their desires for what they expect as their rights as citizens. And these repeated expressions of citizen demands and expectations and rights are taking place in the public arena. And they're taking place in an open way and in a legitimate way. And this is new. There hasn't been the creation of, say, really serious political parties yet, non-governmental organization. Other aspects of political life have not been created in any major way yet, and they will take more times. But that public political sphere has been created, and I think once created cannot be gotten rid of. And in that sphere, the citizens are debating and defining the third new element, which I think is critically important, is the creation of a new social contract. The creation of a new social contract in the Arab world is happening for the first time ever, publicly, democratically, constitutionally, pluralistically, peacefully, in an open arena in which any citizen can make his or her voice heard. This is unprecedented. It's never happened in the history of the Arab world. And the new social contract is a process that has, the old social contract, the ruling bargain, existed between regimes and citizens, but the rules were written by the regimes. The regime said, we give you security, we give you subsidized bread, we give you schools, and in return, you give us loyalty, absolute loyalty, but you have no political rights. And essentially, Arab citizens were turned into consumers. They could go buy as many cell phones and go to as many shopping malls as they wanted, but they had no political rights as citizens. Well, that old social contract was shaped and defined by the ruling political and power elites, the governments, the regimes. Citizens had no say in creating it. This time, the social contract is being written by a combination of different people in society, including the people who are ruling from the top, the armed forces, or the Muslim Brothers briefly, or others, and ordinary citizens. Again, it's in the very, very early stages of this process, but the process has started. This new social contract is also based on the principle of democratic pluralism and the rule of law, which are cherished values in Arab societies that have never been really implemented or freely experienced. And this is a process that, again, has just been launched. It's most advanced in Tunisia. Egypt is close behind. Whether we end up with the rule of law, democratic, pluralistic systems remains to be seen. I think we will. In most of the Arab countries, not all of them, but I think in most Arab countries, we will end up with relatively democratic, certainly pluralistic systems anchored in the rule of law. But this is a process that, again, is in its very, very early stages, and you can see the complexity of agreeing on the articles of the constitutions. And this is not widely reported at all in the Western or the American media, but there's an intense debate and interaction all across societies. Tunisia and Egypt are the most advanced, where every element of the new constitutions are being debated and discussed and reviewed until you reach something that can be seen as a relatively credible national consensus. And we're talking about big sticker items. We're talking about what is the role of Islam in the state? What is the role of Arab national identity in the state? What does it mean to be a citizen of Egypt? What is the role of the army? These are big sticker items. They're not things that are done whimsically. But again, this process of debating a new social contract in the public political sphere, leading to democratic pluralism and the rule of law, all of these things are linked. These are the sequential things that I mentioned, one after the other. And to come up with a democratic and pluralistic system under the rule of law means you need to achieve one major development, which is a constitution written by its citizens and approved and validated by its citizens. We've never had that in the whole history of the Arab world, not just the modern history, the whole history of the last 8,000 years of settled human life in villages, cities, towns, and empires. We've never had constitutions written and validated by ordinary men and women in Arab countries. I believe we will, but it's not going to happen quickly. But that process, again, is underway, and it has proven itself to be complex, contentious, difficult, but persistent. It will not go away. The people out on the streets want to get these constitutions written. They want constitutions that are credible in that they are anchored in a national consensus. When the Muslim Brotherhood tried to ram through a constitution in Egypt that was tailored to the Muslim Brotherhood, there was huge pushback from citizens, from the army, from lots of people, to the point where ultimately the Muslim Brothers were thrown out of office. When the army in Egypt tried itself to manipulate the constitution, to give the armed forces perpetual unchecked powers, there was huge pushback. So if anybody tries to monopolize power in this new public sphere, they're going to get pushback from the other forces in society. And this is what's new. The concept of the sovereignty of the citizens. Citizen sovereignty is now an operational concept. And sometimes it takes the form of a sophisticated person writing an article in a newspaper. Sometimes it takes the form of a group of people who launch a new movement. Sometimes it takes the form of some young people fighting each other in the streets. But it's all part of a process of citizen sovereignty in which the rules of statehood, the exercise of power, the nature of policies, and the quality of rights all derive their validity from the consent of the governed. A consent of the governed, which in our case, unlike your case, and unlike the case in France and England and other places, a consent of the governed which insists from the beginning of this process that all citizens are equal, that they all have the same rights, that those rights are anchored in a constitution, and that constitution has mechanisms to be implemented, not like the old constitutions that we had. So this process of constitution writing is, without doubt, in my mind, the single most important historic and epic nature of the political transitions underway. If the constitutional process does not work, then most of these countries will revert to some primordial style of tribal or religious or autocratic army rule or something like that. And if the constitution writing process works, we will make that noble step forward into more democratic and constitutional life. And if you do get the constitutions written and validated by their citizens coming into effect, which I think we will see very quickly in Tunisia in the next 4 or 5 months, that will lead to yet another of these new factors, which hasn't happened yet, but I believe is coming soon, which is the legitimacy of public authority and the institutions of governance and power. The legitimacy of public authority and the institutions of governance and power. We've always had public authority and power and institutions, but they've never had legitimacy in the eyes of their own people, because they were always the result of a family that takes power in some country, or a military group that takes power, or a foreign colonial power that installs somebody in power. We've never had legitimacy that derives from the will and the constitution writing and the consent of the citizens. And if this process succeeds, we will then end up with legitimate public authorities and institutions of governance and power. Another important achievement that's happened is that Islamist politicians in Tunisia, the Nahda Party, in Egypt, the Muslim Brothers, democratically were elected, constitutionally and legitimately took office, and failed miserably. In Egypt in particular, they provided their year in power was an example of buffoonery and thuggery that have never ever been exercised in public, I think, anywhere in the Arab world, except maybe under Gaddafi's Libya. But we've had this combination of buffoonery and thuggery and incompetence was unprecedented in modern Arab rule by an elected legitimate government. That's the difference between Gaddafi and these guys. These guys were elected, and when they took power, the people, the citizens, were pleased for the most part because they were democratically elected. and people assumed you could get rid of them democratically if they did a bad job. The exercise of power in that 1 year in Egypt and in Tunisia, I think, has been an extremely important phase through which the Arab world had to pass to see Islamists win and be given power, which should have happened before. It happened in Algeria in 1992, but they were prevented. They won elections, they were prevented from taking power. It happened in Palestine with Hamas, but they were quickly sanctioned and boycotted, and that broke up. So this is the first case of democratically elected Islamists who take power and fail miserably. They just were incompetent in addressing either the issues of the needs of the citizens and the rights of the citizens, or the bigger issue of state building and constitution building. They couldn't achieve any breakthroughs on either the micro level of providing services or the macro level of building a new nation, building a new system. And they were rejected. The manner in which the Muslim Brothers in Egypt were thrown out of office, I think, was regretful. They shouldn't have been overthrown by an army coup that rode on the back of popular demonstrations. I think the army should have been more sophisticated and should have found a more legitimate way to pressure the incompetent government to hold early elections and therefore allow the people, through their voting, to get rid of the Muslim Brothers and then let the democratic process run its course. But the army panicked, and what we see, therefore, in the last year is the reality of the two largest and most powerful and most credible groups in Egypt, the armed forces and the Muslim Brothers, both having a chance to rule, with popular support and legitimacy, and both failing miserably. And the lesson is that neither the generals nor the religious figures are competent to run a country. They are competent to do many things, but they're not competent to run a country. It's not what they're trained to do. It's not what they know how to do. It's not something they can learn on the job. And we're at the stage now in Egypt and Tunisia where both of these ruling Islamist groups have left power. In Tunisia in a more democratic and a more consensual way through an agreement to create a transitional technocratic government and then hold new elections, and in Egypt through this popular rebellion, the Tamarrud, followed by the army coup. But the important thing is that year in which the Muslim Brothers exercised power and failed. And this gives, I think, a lot of people much more clarity in terms of understanding when the next round of elections comes up, which it will soon, for parliament, for president, for other things, how to vote for people. And the phase we just passed through the last 2.5 years was absolutely an inevitable and absolutely crucial phase in which people needed to they needed to do what they did. They needed to support the army. They needed to support the Muslim Brothers. They needed to throw out the Muslim Brothers. They needed to show that the leftist, secular, nationalist, non-religious opposition in Egypt were as incompetent as the Muslim Brothers and the armed forces. All of the leftist forces, the liberals, the secularists, whatever you want to call them, were totally incompetent. They were great at standing up to microphones. They were great at getting 60,000 likes on Facebook, but they had no idea how to run a political campaign. They had no idea how to assert their credibility or their legitimacy by actually appealing to their constituents, their citizens. They were too busy speaking to international television stations or trying to figure out how do you use social media. And the lesson of all this at the end of 2.5 years is that the citizen matters. We have the birth of citizens in the Arab world who actually now have the power and the will and the motivation to get out there and be involved in creating their societies. I'll finish quickly, and then we'll have more time for questions and answers. What this tells us about the experience of the last 2.5 years is that we're nowhere close to a democratic transition in any Arab country, but in the few Arab countries that have seriously started the process, which are Egypt, Tunisia, Yemen, and Libya, and each one is in a different condition, in each of those 4 countries, we are seriously starting to put in place the essential building blocks of democratic systems. And those essential building blocks are pluralistic citizen participation, mechanisms of accountability, and a constitutional order that anchors all this in the rule of law. That process, those elements of that process, those elements of democratic life are starting to be implanted and to take root in the soil of different Arab countries. It's very, very early days, and as we see, we'll go back and forth with these things. But once this process starts, and once you have those 2 critical elements of citizens working in a public political sphere, it's virtually inevitable that they will keep moving forward to finally mastering for the first time they've been given an opportunity to master the complexities of creating their own democratic systems. But along with these achievements, there are things that persist that are not so positive. The role of the armed forces and the old guard is still an issue in many Arab countries. There are entrenched forces in the military, in the business community, in civil society, in tribal society, deeply entrenched forces that have ruled for 30 or 40 or 50 years and will not give up power easily. And these forces need to be part of the process of democratic transition, and this mechanism to bring that about is still not achieved or clear yet in any Arab countries. There are powerful roles for subnational identities. What I mean by subnational identities: religion, tribe, sect, ethnicity, even regional identities. So you find in some countries, like in Yemen and Libya, regional issues are huge. So the south in Yemen wants to have its own authority. The east of Libya wants to have its own authority. And some of it is tribal, but some of it is simply that they're different from the people of the west part of Libya. But these religious, sectarian, tribal, and ethnic identities remain very powerful because these people have enjoyed neither the bounty of a democratic state that fulfills its needs to its citizens, nor the rights and power of citizenship. They have enjoyed neither stable statehood, productive statehood, humane statehood, nor active citizenship. And so they go to those elements in their lives that give them what they need: security, representation, opportunity, assistance. You need a job, you need to get into a hospital, you need help, you go to somebody in your religious group, your family group, your tribal group, your neighbors, your cousins, because the state hasn't done what the state should do to meet your needs, and you as an individual citizen are not empowered to achieve these goals in society. So these powerful subnational identities remain the most important factors in how people organize and behave politically, and they need to be brought into the process of and meshed in the process of constitutional building. And this is what makes these constitutions, writing these constitutions, so challenging, is to capture all of these elements so that everybody is satisfied. We still have a lot of meddling by external powers, and by external powers I mean people in the region, like, say, Saudi Arabia or Qatar or Iran or Turkey or somebody, and powers abroad, like the US or Russia or China or far away. So local, regional powers or foreign powers. There's still a lot of meddling inside these countries in the political process and in military issues. And finally, we still have elements of political violence rearing their head occasionally. But most of the political transformations or political action that has taken place throughout the Arab countries in the last 2 years and 10 months, most of it has not been violent. Most of it has been peaceful. and it has been part of this quest to find those mechanisms that will allow you to make that transition to a fully democratic, constitutional, and pluralistic system. But there are still people who resort quickly to violence, including foreign countries like the US, like the Russians, like the Israelis, like the Iranians. Nobody escapes that one. A lot of foreign countries who also use violence in the Arab world. And what remains to be achieved, I think we have to start at the biggest level, which is the validity of the configuration of statehood. We are still in a situation where many Arab countries are not sure that their existing geography will remain as it is. We've already seen South Sudan secede 2 years ago peacefully. We've seen the Yemenis have an intense debate about whether the South will pull away. Northern Iraq is an autonomous unit now where the Kurds are, and it'll probably stay that way. Syria may break up. We don't know. Libya may or may not stay together. And we shouldn't prejudge this. People applauded when Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia broke up into smaller units. People thought that was the right thing to do because it gave those smaller units nation states or countries that reflected the will of their citizens and were more responsive to the citizens' needs. So if people in the Arab world decide they want to change the geography of their countries and they do it peacefully and democratically like South Sudan did, then we should let them do that. It's none of our business what people want to do as long as it's done peacefully and democratically. But so the validity and the legitimacy of existing states is something that is not clear, whether they'll all stay in the same shape they are or some of them might evolve. We don't have constitutional accords on national values or institutions of governance yet, but we're very close, I think, in Tunisia. And I think what we'll see happening in the process of constitutional democratic transformations is the same process we saw with the beginning of these uprisings, is that when it happens in one country in a credible way, it will start a process that will roll across the region in other countries. And we're still waiting for that one country that makes the breakthrough to have a truly credible democratic Arab governance system designed by its own people, validated by its own people. And I think others will very quickly want to follow this. The balance between civilian and military authority remains an open question in most of the Arab countries. And we don't know in which direction this will go. It took a long time for Turkey, decades and decades for Turkey to finally push the military out of governance and let the civilian authorities rule in Turkey. It'll take us a long time as well to do that, but that civilian-military balance is a critical point that has to be decided in the coming years. And the role of religion and tribalism in political life are huge issues that have to be shaped by the people of these countries. And they will be designed differently in different countries. So a Yemen or a Libya or a Jordan will have a system of governance that reflects tribal identities much more than, say, a Morocco or a Lebanon or an Egypt or a Tunisia. Each country will be different. Some will emphasize religious values, some will emphasize tribal values, some will emphasize pan-Arab values. All of these things have to be clarified. And the hierarchy of identities that defines individual people, their religious identity, their civil identity, their national identity, their tribal identity, all of these identities need to be sorted out. They can only be sorted out in situations where people live in orderly states where their civil rights are the first level of their ability to sort these things out. So if you live in like in the United States, for most people, you live in a country that guarantees you your rights, so you can decide if your identity as an African American or Hispanic American or Jewish American or your gender or your baseball team or whatever is your favorite, your biggest identity, you can make that decision because you don't have to worry about walking out into the street and getting killed by somebody blowing up your mosque or your church or your synagogue. Well, so when you have citizen rights and civil rights and human rights in an orderly society, these other identities sort themselves out. They become much less important. Until that happens, they're the most powerful instruments of not only of personal identity, but also of political interactions among people in society. And the last two quick words, one about Palestine, one about Syria. I haven't mentioned the Arab-Israeli conflict because it's not really a part of this process. But the Arab-Israeli conflict remains the most significant and the oldest force for radicalism and destabilization in the Middle East. Unless the Arab-Israeli conflict is resolved peacefully and according to the rule of law that gives Israelis and Palestinians equal rights simultaneously, until that happens, there will continue to be a major destabilizing, radicalizing element all across the region. And you saw a few examples in Egypt where something happened at the Israeli embassy or shooting in Sinai, where public opinion exploded against Israel or against the United States. This remains a powerful, powerful driver of sentiments, of people's political sentiments, the Arab-Israeli conflict. But it is not an issue in these uprisings. These uprisings are about domestic dignity, rights of citizenship in their own countries. But I would argue...
I was going to get it this long time ago.
Oh, thank you. But I would argue that one of the reasons that so many citizens across the region lost confidence in the legitimacy or efficacy of their own governments and rose up against them is because of the sentiment that their own governments had lost legitimacy and sovereignty because of their total inability to address the Arab-Israeli issue, to either make war or peace with Israel, peacefully or militarily, but they couldn't do either. And many Arab people found themselves living in countries where their own governments, in order to make decisions about certain political or military moves, had to get the consent of the Israeli government or the American Congress in order to buy a certain tank or to put a soldier here or put a soldier there. This kind of dehumanizing, degrading, loss of sovereignty, loss of respect was a strong underlying element in the sense among millions and millions of ordinary Arabs that their own governments had failed in one of the greatest challenges of modern times, which is the contest between Arabism and Zionism. And that contest doesn't have to be a contest of war, that we can solve the Arab-Israeli conflict peacefully, as hopefully will happen, but the Arab governments have been incompetent in either peaceful or military resolution of this conflict. So it's a constant underlying driver that needs to be resolved. And my last point is about Syria. Syria today is the biggest proxy war of all modern time. Nowhere in the world in the last 100 years have you seen a war with so many local, regional, and foreign actors fighting each other through local proxies. Syria captures all of the modern political, ethnic, nationalist conflicts in the Middle East. Arab-Israeli, Arab-Iranian, Sunni Shia, secular Islamist, Republican monarchist, Kurdish Arab, pro-American, anti-American. You take all the conflicts of the last 10 years, every one of them is active simultaneously through the proxies fighting each other inside Syria. This is the most complicated conflict anybody has faced in modern times, much more complicated than, say, Yugoslavia or South Africa or other places. And it will not be resolved until the external drivers, the United States, Russia, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, are the four main external drivers. Until those four get together and agree on some kind of peaceful ceasefire and then transition, the conflict, I don't think, will be resolved. It started as an uprising, peaceful uprising, by Syrians wanting their citizenship rights, the things I talked about, but it quickly turned into a much more complicated regional and global conflict, partly because of the direct linkage with the Arab-Israeli conflict. I think we need to keep in mind, while we're looking at internal changes within Arab countries, there are regional and global forces that are also still very much at play that make it far more complicated than we think. But I remain hopeful that we are seeing the very early building blocks of democratic principles being activated and practiced in Arab countries, which I hope will eventually, in the best of circumstances, lead to a positive transition to democratic pluralism. In most Arab countries, I think it'll happen. In some, it will not. It'll be very much like the former Soviet empire that collapsed in 1990. Most of those countries are democratic. A few of them are still old-fashioned tyrannies. And I think we'll have the same thing in the Arab world. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Rami Khouri, for those thoughtful comments. We have a tradition here at the Korbel School when we invite a speaker to deliver a lecture. One of the faculty members is invited to provide some comments, and it just so happens that I'm the faculty member that was chosen to provide comments. So I want to offer the following comments to your lecture, and I want to challenge you on some of the things that you said. But I guess my first observation on your lecture is that much of what you had to say in terms of your cautiously optimistic prognosis about the future of the region, I think really applies to the region if we were having this conversation prior to July 3rd of this year. And I'm speaking specifically about the case of Egypt. Your discussion, I think, of the case of Egypt seems, in my reading, to ignore a deeper and more disturbing crisis that has taken over that country, that in my reading of what's happening in Egypt today, there is this fascistic moment that has arrived that reminds one of Chile after 1973, that reminds us of this nationalist hysteria that has swept over the country. So in your talk, you talked about, with respect to Egypt, the birth of citizens, the birth of citizenry, the development of a new social contract, the building of democratic systems that are being put in place, the possibility of new elections coming where people will learn lessons from the experience of the Muslim Brotherhood. I think that's all completely wishful thinking. There are no less. The only lesson to be learned here in my reading is that there really was no serious revolution to speak of in Egypt to begin with. The military always was in power, even though Morsi was elected. The deep state was still there. They waited for their moment, and now they have crushed the process of democratization, which I agree held the promise of these things materializing down the road. But now that it has all come to a crashing halt, now that you have the attempt by the Egyptian military, cheered by some elements of the liberal intelligentsia, of celebrating the eradication of the largest social movement in the country that has roots that go back to 1928, Human Rights Watch described the massacre this summer in Egypt as the largest single massacre in Egyptian modern history. And I'm talking about the massacre of the Muslim Brotherhood supporters in Rabab Adawiya, which was the first sort of phase of an attempt to completely rewrite. I mean, so you talk about a social contract. There's a social contract on the democratic prospects of the Egyptian people. I don't see this moving in any positive direction. So I would like to push you further in sort of commenting on where Egypt is today. I think things are headed for a much darker direction that you sort of suggested. That's point number one. The second point has to do with your comments on Syria. You described Syria as, quote, the biggest proxy war in the region, or perhaps, in a long time that the world has witnessed. I think the situation is, again, much graver than simply a proxy war. We are talking about in Syria today the largest humanitarian crisis that the world has seen in the 21st century. Over 100,000 people killed, surpassing the killing fields of Bosnia. We have the use of chemical weapons. We have 2 million refugees, about 5 million people internally displaced. Last week, the United Nations predicted that the refugee flows out of Syria will double by the end of next year, destabilizing the entire region. I was reading in the BBC a news feed the other day that that Muslim clerics have now given permission to citizens of Syria that they are now religiously permitted to eat cats and dogs if it could save them from starvation, because there's this rebel stronghold on the outskirts of Damascus that is under siege by the Assad army, and people there are starving. And so the representative, the director of Doctors Without Borders, who was quoted in this BBC report, talked about the complete absurdity of this situation, and I'm quoting him, where the Assad regime and the international community is perfectly happy allowing international inspectors to roam around the country freely in pursuit of chemical weapons, while at the same time aid convoys are being blocked to starving civilians. And that's the international community's position. And so the question of Syria really cries out for an answer here. The longer it continues, the longer I think this conflict is going to consume the region. And so there's a debate here about what should be done, simply sort of waiting for a diplomatic settlement to emerge, waiting for some sort of convergence of points of view among the regional and international actors, I think is wishful thinking. There are, I think, deeper issues that are very much tied to the Arab Spring that you sort of talked about, that are at the root of the Syrian conflict. The struggle for self-determination, the fact that you have one family in power for 43 years who represents arguably the most extreme sort of apparatus of political expression that the Arab world has seen since World War II in the House of Assad family, and the deep desire for people to change that, and that desire being brutally crushed by the House of Assad with collaboration and support by Iran and Russia. So I think the crisis in Syria is much more dire, much more catastrophic than your comments have presented to us, and I'd like to push you a bit further on what can be done and what should be done with respect to the case of Syria. And sort of the last sort of theme that often comes up in the context of the Arab Spring, there's actually two themes, but I'll just focus on. One is this whole question that often concerns a lot of Americans and Westerners, understandably so, is the whole status and the plight of minority groups, minority religions within these societies in the context of the Arab Spring. There's almost this moment where people are wishing for a return to the old dictatorial ways. Weren't cops perhaps better off under Mubarak? Wouldn't it be better if perhaps Assad will re-establish control over, all of Syria? Aren't minorities better? So how do we sort of deal with this question of minority rights? So three questions really to push you on Egypt, what's happening in Egypt today, the crisis and the tragedy unfolding before our eyes in Syria, and then this whole question of minority rights. How do we deal with politically, intellectually, what advice, what strategies should the international community be pursuing in order to sort of deal with the legitimate question of the protection of minorities within these societies? You want to stand there?
Can we stay here?
Yeah, we can stay there. Do we have to move this? I think you just speak out loud, yeah.
Bring it here.
This way. We'll put it in front. Maybe we should pull the podium back just a bit so the people better. Yeah, there it is.
Is that good?
Thank you, Nader. Well, I'm glad to see that University of Denver chose the right person to head the new Middle East Center. You have all the great questions. And they're all absolutely good comments. The question of Egypt, it's absolutely true what Nader said broadly in terms of this is a setback. It's a huge setback, and I mentioned that when I said it was cyclical, it goes forwards, it goes backwards. This is a backwards moment. What we don't know, and it's still not clear, we don't know what is the sentiment inside the minds and hearts of those 20 or 30 million Egyptians who went out on the streets repeatedly in the last 2.5 years to challenge both the armed forces and the Muslim Brothers and the old guard. We don't know if they really want the army to stay in power like this forever, or if they are just happy with the army stepping in now, ending the period of incompetence and that frightening moment when the Muslim Brothers were ruining the country, and if this is just a temporary refuge in which citizens are happy to have the army rule. My sense is that widespread support of the armed forces now is a perfectly normal, natural expression of the first line of people's fears, which is they want to be able to send their kids to school and come back home and not be kidnapped and not have a bombing. They want to be able to buy bread and fuel for their family. Those basic fundamental issues of security and basic services were threatened for many, many Egyptians. And that's the first line, that's the most important thing for people right now. And to do that, you need to bring in the armed forces or some strong man who can deliver those things, security and services. And that's totally normal reaction. The question is this a long-term prognosis for ending the democratic transition and keeping the military in power and letting the deep state reassert itself and become the formal state? I don't think so. I think that's why I said, I think the birth of citizenries and the public sphere is a reality that will not go away, but has not yet manifested itself in new forms of governance. And these transitions are very, very complex in conditions of economic stress, sectarian tensions, and environmental pressures like water and other issues. So I think in Egypt, the army's push and the support that the army has now from many people, including liberals, is a passing phenomenon. I don't think it's a permanent state. I may be wrong. Let's meet again in a couple of years and see where Egypt is. But it's always going to be a balancing act between bread on the table and freedom and dignity. If you go back to the beginning of the uprisings, if you go back to Mohammed Bouazizi, what does he represent? Mohammed Bouazizi was a fruit and vegetable seller in Sidi Bouzid in rural Tunisia who was making $73 a week. And he was the only breadwinner in his family, and he was keeping his brothers and sisters in school and his mother alive with the money he brought home. When the police lady overturned his cart and took away his scales, she prevented him from earning a living. And he couldn't then fulfill the material needs of his family. When he went to the governor's office a few hours later to protest, to get a redress of grievance, to get his local political authority to fix this situation where he had been abused by this police lady and was not able to make a living, he went to get a redress of grievance, and the local governor's office told him to go away. We have nobody to speak to you, the governor's not here, go away, don't bother. In other words, the two people who represented his own government, the policewoman and the local governor's office, within a span of a few hours, told him that he doesn't have the right to carry on a normal life and to fulfill his material needs for him and his family, and he doesn't have the right to protest and seek political redress of grievance. In other words, he has no rights. He's not a human being. He's not a citizen. He's an invisible person. And it was the combination of those two things that caused him to go and, I assume, because he died, we don't know. But he didn't set himself on fire when the police lady took his scale away. He set himself on fire when the two dimensions of his life, the material satisfaction of his social and economic needs, and the political satisfaction of his rights as a citizen, the intangibles of his rights, when his rights and his needs were both denied to him, he then he lost it, and he set himself on fire. We don't, again, know exactly why. So what I'm saying is that there's this balance. He accurately captures the sense among hundreds of millions of Arabs of this balance between your material needs and your intangible rights. So you have a lot of poor Arabs who didn't protest in the past. And then you have a lot of Arabs who had no political rights. They were materially okay, but no political rights, and they didn't protest either. But when you were denied both your political and your material rights, that's when something happens and you go out into the street and you risk your life because you can't continue living in that situation. We don't know where that balance is among ordinary Egyptians today. If they obviously lean now to the balance of having their material needs satisfied. Forget about democracy for the next few months. Let's get this situation calmed down so that you can walk in the street safely and buy food and buy gasoline. They're going through a transitional process according to the framework that the army laid out. We don't know if this is credible. We'll find out in the next few months when they finish the draft of the Constitution. It's debated, it's given to a referendum. The truth is we don't know how it's going to turn out. But I tend to I come on the side of the more hopeful people because I sense that what was unleashed in Egypt and in Tunisia in December and January of 2010, 2011 was a historic force, equivalent to what was unleashed in Montgomery, Alabama, and Birmingham, Alabama in the 1950s and 60s. It was a force that couldn't be stopped. It could be momentarily stopped, but it couldn't be stopped in its forward march towards full citizenship and dignity and freedom and ultimately democracy. So I believe we're still in this backward step in Egypt, but the better things are yet to come. In Syria, it is a massive humanitarian crisis. We see it every day in Beirut in many forums. I think the reality is that we are dealing with political systems all around the region, not just in Syria, all around the region, that don't particularly care about the suffering of ordinary people. And this is one of the reasons why these uprisings started to happen. You would have thought by now that the countries around Syria, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, Egypt also is getting a lot of refugees from Syria, that they would have gotten together and held some kind of consultation about what to do, at least at the humanitarian level. Forget about ending the war. But they haven't. So we're dealing with a situation in which, unfortunately, we're going to probably see more and more people suffering. We went through this in Iraq years ago. And Iraq, it's still happening. 50, 60, 70 people are dying almost every day because of bombings and stuff. So the level of suffering, while it is terrible and criminal, has not yet reached the point where it is politically catalytic, and it's not pushing the people in the region or internationally to do anything about it. And this is a huge moral and political dilemma for which I don't have the answer. I don't know what to do about Syria. That's why I think Syria, I think, will change when the cost to the external powers becomes too high for them to bear. Mm-hmm. When Iran, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and the US start feeling a negative cost politically, refugees, security, economically, in other ways, when the cost becomes too high, there'll probably be some pressure to try to calm it down. But I'm very fearful that this isn't going to happen soon, and Syria will stay with us like this for a long time. It's possible that one side might beat the other, but probably not, because there's massive amounts of weapons going into both sides. And the issue of minorities and rights is a fascinating one, and it's interesting how much attention this is getting in the constitution writing process. In Tunisia and Egypt, again, they're the most advanced cases, but you'll have it soon coming up in other countries. This is an issue that people in the region care about, but have never been able to really shape themselves. And the political orders that we've lived in have been orders that were dominated by families or individuals at the top. So the values of society, whether they're Arab or Islamic or traditional tribal values, whatever they are, the Arab values and Islamic values have never really shaped political cultures in our countries. So you can look at some of the Arab countries and you see minorities are mistreated in one place or another. And it's due to a combination of different reasons, but the fact is that now we might be able to see a system being born in some countries where people address minority rights in a formal constitutional manner. It is true that there is a fear, you're absolutely right, Nader, there is a fear that by the time we do this, there aren't going to be any minorities left, because a lot of them are leaving. The Jewish minorities in the Arab countries have mostly left, and understandably because of the Arab-Israeli conflict and tensions that were felt at the local level. And other minorities are, you're getting a separation of pluralistic societies, first of all. So in places like Iraq and Lebanon, Syria, mixed neighborhoods are less mixed than they used to be. People are going to live with their own kind, whether religious or ethnic or whatever. And then many of the minorities are immigrating. They're just leaving because they won't put up with this kind of danger and lack of opportunity much longer. So it is a real problem in the Arab world that the mosaic of pluralistic demographic groups may be much less colorful and varied than it used to be. And you might end up with predominantly Muslim Arabs who shape this region. And then you'll have pockets possibly of Kurds, of Druze, the Christians will remain scattered everywhere because they don't have one sort of central homeland. But it's a major problem, and it goes back to the problem of lack of citizenship in a democratic state. And the vulnerabilities that people felt, this is it's a big debate that people have all the time. I discussed it a lot with Christians and other minorities. So we say, well, what's better, to live under Saddam Hussein and Hafiz al-Assad like they used to be, under that kind of authoritarian system, but you can ring the church bell every Sunday, or to go through this transition and end up living in a country maybe like, I don't know, Belgium or something a little Canada or something, where your rights as a citizen are guaranteed, and you can go ring your bell anywhere you want in the country without. So it's a big debate about, and it goes back to the question of what's more important, your physical, biological security, just to be able to live without any rights, or is it your humanity and your ability to actually exercise your freedoms, to think, to read, to speak, to debate, to dance, to create novels, to do theater, to dress the way you want? Are those freedoms important, to hold power accountable, to have less corruption? Are those freedoms more important, or is it more important simply to have your physical safety and not have any of those freedoms, but to be safe and say, and this is what a lot of these regimes were saying in the past, that our minorities are safe and you can have a church here and this, that. So it's a real live debate. But the minorities in the Arab world definitely are in a precarious position, and the Arab world as a whole has not addressed this issue in any meaningful manner. But the question of minority rights will be solved not by addressing minorities, but by addressing the rights of the majorities to be full citizens in stable democratic societies.
Great. Okay, we have some time for questions. First question there, go ahead.
Neither of you mentioned the disruptive effect of the Al-Qaeda, how serious it is, especially where are they getting the weapons to continue creating this? Is this a temporary thing, or is it a serious matter for what? Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. The discussion of the disruptive effect of Al-Qaeda was not discussed in the presentation. Where are they getting the weapons? How serious of a threat is this moving forward?
So I assume by Al-Qaeda you mean Al-Qaeda itself and the other groups like it, the kind of Salafi, militant terrorist groups. They are growing very rapidly, and if you notice, they only grow in situations of chaos. So where did these groups thrive? Afghanistan, the border regions of Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, Iraq after the invasion, now Syria, and parts of Lebanon, again, that are slightly chaotic. So it's only in conditions of chaos and warfare where there is no central government authority or any authority, that these groups can take root. They are a huge problem in the short run. There are now probably maybe 10, 20,000 trained, experienced Qaeda-type militants or terrorists, I would call them. These are criminals, these guys. And Syria and Iraq have become the world's biggest mobilizer, trainer, and exporter of these kinds of people. And they are going out all over the Middle East. We've had them in Lebanon and Jordan bombing and this, and they will have an impact across other countries as well, maybe here. This is a short-term phenomenon, I believe. These people have no anchorage in society. They've tried very, very hard to capitalize on the grievances that ordinary Arabs have expressed. Arab-Israeli issues, foreign invasions, corruption, autocratic government, all the grievances that people express. Al-Qaeda has tried to capitalize on those and exploit them, but has failed miserably. They have no serious support in society at all, other than their small pockets of followers. They're like cults. You have to look at them as cults, but these cults thrive in the conditions of the Arab world, where you have people like Muammar al-Gaddafi running a country for 40 years and turning it into what it is, and then you have the Egyptian army running the country for 60 years and turning it into what it is. So in these conditions, groups like this can appeal to disaffected, disenfranchised citizens. But I don't see them as a long-term threat. Once these societies restore order and create better new systems, these guys will be driven out of town, and there will be battles. They will be fought in some cases.
Question right there.
I was curious of your thoughts, just the recently disposed elites, and also elites in these transitional societies such as Tunisia, Ghannouchi, Ennahda, the different leadership, and I was very curious on the relativity of the violence that's been occurring at a low level at these different societies. I'm curious to think of it's going to be seen as a revolving door, where you have disposed elites, but you have elites that were in power institutionally, whether it's security services or political institutions. Who do you see in the long term, or even the short term, as a revolving door that they're just going to go back in power?
That the old guard goes back in power?
Exactly.
It's possible in some places, absolutely. Like I said, like the former Soviet Union. There's some former Soviet Empire countries that are very democratic, and others that are still run by, authoritarian, iron-fisted dictators. So it's possible. You also have a gradation of legitimate authorities in Arab countries. Some of the monarchies have more legitimacy among their own people than some of the republics. The monarchies are facing their own challenges. People in Jordan, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait are raising their voices again. Every Arab country, with no exception, every Arab country has experienced some sort of greater citizen expression of their grievances and their demands and their aspirations. In some cases, the extreme was Tunis and Egypt, where they got rid of the leadership, or a war in Syria or Libya. But in other cases, in the Gulf countries and Jordan, it's small demonstrations, mostly social media type complaints. But people are speaking out. They've lost their fear, and they've given up on being acquiescent, silent citizens. They want to express their concerns, and they want to say what they want to happen. But in some countries, the old systems will just reform a little bit and give people a little bit of extra freedoms, a little bit of fighting corruption, just limited amounts of reform. And this happened in the late 80s, when the first round of elections took place in the Arab countries. There were demonstrations, but they were more limited. They were mostly about bread prices and milk prices, gas prices. But the governments most of the governments opened up. They held elections, they liberalized the press, but they didn't really change the exercise of power at the top. And so I think this is likely, but I think many of the Arab governments will transform ultimately into more democratic systems, and some will absolutely stay as they are. But how long can these kinds of governments stay in power? I mean, this is a question we have to ask all around the world. So I don't expect huge changes to occur in every single Arab country. But I think the majority where you've had large-scale public protests will probably make transitions. But you still have countries like Sudan, like Algeria, that are ripe for big change. But it hasn't happened yet. And usually what happens, what decides these things is if the central government has a core security system and enough money to keep it in place. And enough money to dish out to people. So those combinations of things determine if these governments fall or if they don't fall.
Jim.
If you were invited to the White House to advise President Obama, what would you tell him?
On the Arab up?
Repeat that, no, repeat that.
Yeah, the question is if he was invited to the White House to advise President Obama, what would you say to President Obama?
I would tell President Obama that this is the most fruitful moment where the sentiments of millions and millions of ordinary Arabs coincide directly with the values of millions and millions of Americans. That this is a moment to pounce and to bring together these two societies on the basis of their shared commitment to citizenship and democratic pluralism and constitutional governance. You've got tens of millions of Arabs who are out there demonstrating and dying in some cases because they want a constitution and they want their citizenship rights. And this is what's supposed to be the message of America. Well, if this is the case, then the U.S. should respond to those forces, bond with them, and help the transitions in the way that Arab people ask for help and in no other way.
But if I could follow
Sure.
up, I think he knows that, but what should he do?
What-
That's the problem.
Specifically, right?
Yes.
In specific terms.
In specific terms, I think, well, he has to, each country is different. So I think what the United States should do in specific terms is reward or support any moves that people over there make for these democratic transitions. So if people, the U.S. shouldn't go to a country and tell them do this, or we'll help you, we'll send you advisors to do this or do this. They should basically respond to the initiatives that people take inside Arab countries. And if people are making moves, for instance, for constitutional change, the U.S. should step in and say, these are the values that we support. What can we do to help you? You need money for your bread prices? Do you need training for school teachers? Do you need agricultural equipment? So to reward, support behavior that the Arab people themselves initiate in that process. And when people take counter steps that are against democratic transformation, the United States should express its opposition to that, even in situations like, for instance, Bahrain. I think it's a big mistake for the United States to basically support the Bahrain government and what the Saudi government is doing there, simply because, well, the American ships are docked there and we need it as a security. In the long run, your security doesn't come from ships. Your security comes from citizens who respect you. And this is the lesson of every democratic transformation around the world. You don't bring security with weapons. You bring security with political values and treating people decently. And so the U.S. should be clearly, emphatically, consistently on the side of the people who are working for democratic transformations. And every step that happens, the U.S. should be seen to be supporting it in a practical way, with money, with technical expertise, with whatever with trade agreements, whatever is useful to those people. And people should, and the U.S. should harness a global movement that supports this. And it would be a big help if they got the Israelis to stop settlements too, because if there was a move to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict through the rule of law, it would show that the Americans actually believe that the rule of law and democracy apply to everybody, and nobody is excluded.
Let's take one more question, because Rami does have a flight to catch, so go ahead, sir.
Okay, Dr. Rami, I have a question regarding Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. How come it's all stable there and nobody is revolting? Isn't it because the bellies are full and they don't care to really revolt?
Okay.
It's basically an economic problem. So the whole revolution in the Middle East.
So okay, we got it. The question is, why is there no public unrest and revolt in Saudi Arabia and in the Gulf countries? Is it because their bellies are full, and isn't that the solution to dealing with these questions?
Yes, plus, plus it's another thing funny that United States, okay, sides with Saudi Arabia
Right.
to support even helping the Mu'arada or
Yeah.
rebels in Syria,
Right.
which are extremists. So how do you explain all that?
Well, again, that's why I'm saying consistency is would be important, is very important if it can be promoted. Now, in Saudi Arabia, consistency in American policy. So in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, those are wealthy countries for the most part, and there is no big public revolt, but there are small movements of citizens within those countries who are raising questions, and in some cases raising them in public for the first time. This is what's new. This what I talked about, citizen sovereignty, that the sense that ordinary citizens have rights, and they have the right to express those rights. They can talk about them. If they can't walk out on the street and hold up a placard, they can do a tweet or do something on Facebook or send an email message or appear on Jazeera TV or something like that. So you have small groups in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Kuwait to a different extent who are not revolting against the government, but they're asking the government to pay more attention to participatory rights and to respecting human rights. The Gulf countries, Kuwait, UAE, Bahrain, they're putting people in trial and in jail for tweeting a message that they consider critical of the regime, and which they say is dangerous to the regime. So you're getting, this is part of this counter-revolutionary wave, this excessive conservatism, which doesn't want anybody to have the rights to speak out and express their views. You have some people in Saudi Arabia who, mostly Shiites, who are demonstrating in small groups out in the public holding placards because the government has put their men and sons in jail for demonstrating against what they consider discrimination against Shiites. So there are small pockets of activism, but nothing on a large scale. We don't know if this is going to change or not. I don't expect major changes in the Gulf countries, but the fact that these small movements have started is, I think, politically significant. In Kuwait, you have, in some cases, thousands of people demonstrating because they don't want the emir to keep rigging the parliamentary election system. They want less corruption and more participation. And again, you have some issues in Kuwait, like the Bedouin people who are Kuwaitis, but they don't have nationality. So there are different reasons, but the common denominator of all these things is that people who were once silent and afraid are no longer silent and no longer afraid. They speak out, and they're speaking out simply to have their rights respected. They're not speaking out to burn the country or overthrow the regime. So this is, I mean, the abnormal manner in which Arab governments have ruled the region for the last 40, 50 years is really the big shocker that we should be dealing with. And now people are starting to address it in very different ways in different countries.
I think that from the trigger is economics. Those people
Not always
are
economics.
financially rich.
Yeah, but you have rich Kuwaitis, and Emiratis who are demonstrating and asking their government for more rights. So it's, as I said, it's the balance between material and political rights.
We're going to have to end it there. Please join me in thanking Rami Khouri for being with us today. I'm happy to announce, although it's not formal yet, that Rami and our center are in discussion to bring Rami back as a visiting fellow at our center. So Rami, this is not goodbye. This is
Thank
until
you.
we meet again, hopefully back here.
Inshallah.
Not too long ago, not too long in the future, inshallah. We
Thank
have
you.
2 events next week on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Peter Beinart and Rashid Khalidi. If you haven't seen the posters, they're up here. You can get more information. Thanks for coming. Please take more keys on your way out.
مرحبا دكتور.
اضرب